Night falls over the forests of New England. A sudden noise.
What was that?
And he appears.
Hello, Spookaroos! Welcome back to the show. I say welcome back, but of course, as you've seen on social media, the show has changed. We are no longer Spooky Ass Shit or Spooky AS. We are Spooky Times with Eric D. I'm still your host, Eric Dwinells. That's my full name, but we'll just say D and make it simple. It's easier that way. I will talk more about why I changed the name at the end of the show in case you didn't see it on the social medias. But basically, it's just going to simplify things and hopefully make us seem a little bit more professional as we roll into our, what is this, 5th year, 6th year, something like that, of this show. And as we march toward our 200th episode. So new name, but same host and same subject matter and all that stuff. None of that's going to change. What'd you think of that little intro I threw on? Now, you know me. If you listen to the show, I like to change up the intros. So that's not something, the dialogue and everything, that's not something you're going to hear all the time. But I just thought it might be fun to throw on here and there and give you a little bit more of the vibe of, hey, like, yeah, it's spooky, but it's also a little bit silly. And so that's what I was going for. So hopefully it worked. Anyway, welcome to Spooky Times. I am your Eric D. So let's get started. We're going to talk today about a sea serpent. And this is another hometown haunt. This isn't my hometown, of course, but Massachusetts is my home state. And we're staying right in Massachusetts, as I am wont to do very often, because we are a spooky state. And we got a lot of spooky stuff going on. And I was not very familiar with Gloucester until a couple years ago when I started hanging out more in Salem and I was on the North Shore more often. But I have to say, Gloucester is really making a good impression on me. And if you're someone who's into spooky stuff, then you got to check out Gloucester, because not only do they have the sea serpent, which we're about to talk about, but they also have Dogtown is partly located in Gloucester, and so is Hammond Castle, which is a very cool kind of spooky place to check out. First of all, the guy that made Hammond Castle, he was like this eccentric inventor millionaire, and he was so wealthy that he could afford to import parts of medieval castles from Europe, and he would build his own castle, Hammond Castle, in Gloucester, using parts of these old castles from Europe. And he also incorporated tombstones from ancient Rome into his walls. So that's a man with a good design style. I like that. Not afraid to use gravestones in his wall decorating. Not sure how respectful that is, but I guess, I don't know. History pillaging is a subject for another day, I guess, is what I'll leave it at. Let's talk about this Gloucester Sea Serpent. Just before we get too into it, I do want to mention, when I take a lot of my information from one particular source, I like to point that out, give credit where credit is due, and let people know I'm not trying to steal anything. I'm just borrowing for the sake of some good storytelling. But I want to make sure I get the names out there of the original sources. So a lot of today's information comes directly from an article in the Gloucester Daily Times, and this was an article called The Myth and Mystery of the Great Gloucester Sea Serpent, and it was written by Tom Halstead. So thank you very much for your research into this and making this episode possible. Let's get into it. Our story begins on August 6th, 1817. Two women were walking along Gloucester Harbor when they looked out into the water and spotted something very unusual. They saw what they believed to be an extremely large serpent rising up and out of the water right at the entrance to the harbor. Startled, they ran into a local shop where they reported this creature. The shop owner dismissed the woman, assuming that they were just pulling his leg, but then a local fisherman who overheard the woman's claim spoke up to report that he too had seen something strange in the harbor that very morning. He hadn't spoken up before because he literally could not believe what he had seen, and assumed that it had just been a trick of his imagination until he heard these women say that they'd seen it too. Later that day, the captain of a coasting vessel ran into a busy local auction house to report that he had just seen a 60-foot sea serpent at the entrance of the bay. He was laughed out of the room. Though gossip began in Gloucester that day, very few citizens put any stock into the so-called sea serpent, but reports of strange sightings continued to filter in. On August 8th, a woman named Mrs. Story was walking along the beach when, glancing off into the distance, she noticed what she thought was a large fallen tree or a log that had somehow washed up on the beach. Then she saw it move. Whatever it was plunged into the harbor. On August 10th, Lydia Wanson saw the mysterious creature near Rocky Neck and estimated that it was 60 or 70 feet long. Later that day, a man named William Rowe reported seeing 100 feet of the creature borne on the water. Borne means traveling by the water, carried by the water. Amos Story, husband of the woman who spotted the unusual moving log on the beach, gave a very detailed description of the serpent that he saw that day as well. When, after hearing his description, a neighbor suggested that perhaps what Mr. Story had seen was actually just a dog playing in the water, Mr. Story said it could not be so. The creature he saw had a head like a sea turtle and, quote, much larger than the head of any dog I ever saw. With all these reported sightings flooding in, it was not so easy to laugh them all off. Now, the public became interested. By August 14th, spectators had begun to line the harbor shores in hopes of seeing the serpent, and they weren't disappointed. Reported sightings began to pour in even more furiously that the serpent was seen near 10-Pound Island and Norman's Woe, and further into the harbor, as far as Pavilion Beach. The body was said to be brown in color, and some said it looked very much like, quote, the joints in wooden buoys on a net rope, like a string of gallon kegs 100 feet long. Reports did not always agree on what the creature looked like. Some said the creature had smooth skin. Others claimed they saw large, bumpy patches all the way down the creature's back. Most reports agree that the creature moved up and down, and in and out of the water, much the same way that an inchworm moves. Others claimed that it slithered side to side, just like a snake would. 2 reports mentioned seeing a 12-inch long horn growing out of the center of the beast's head. Several reports noted that it had a long, forked tongue, bright red, which it would sometimes flick around to the back of its own head. Must have been a very long tongue. On August 18th, one man reported seeing not one, but 2 serpents playing in the harbor, but this would be the only witness to claim to have seen more than one creature. Most in town began to accept that there was some kind of mysterious creature in Gloucester Harbor, and for many the question wasn't so much what, but why. Why had this great serpent suddenly come to visit? Some feared it was a sign of God's displeasure. Others agreed that God had sent it, but as a precious gift to be enjoyed by the people of Gloucester. The local fishermen and harbor business owners had their own thoughts. For several days now, gawkers had been interfering with their day-to-day business. If there was a great serpent in the harbor, it, like the gawkers, was also a nuisance, since it may be eating or scaring away the fish that they were trying to catch. Though the general population may have felt differently, the seagoing men of Gloucester mostly agreed that if they had the opportunity, they would kill this so-called sea serpent. One local marksman claimed that he actually took a clear shot with his musket, and he was sure that he had struck the beast, yet his bullet seemed to have no effect. A sketch was drawn of the creature and was widely circulated. The sketch is very striking, but it strangely doesn't seem to resemble any of the eyewitness descriptions of the beast. Instead, it shows a creature looking more like a Chinese dragon than a sea serpent, with a fierce, monstrous eye, a striped neck, and scales that kind of look like feathers, floating on top of the sea instead of, up and down in it. Despite its inaccuracies, the sketch has become the most famous image associated with the Gloucester Sea Serpent, and it will instantly pop up when you Google the event, even to this day. Now, as I mentioned earlier, sailors hoped to hunt the creature and be rid of the nuisance, but others hoped for a more scientific approach. The newly formed Linnaean Society of New England stepped in, wondering if this giant serpent had not slithered to the surface somehow from depths unknown. Named for the 18th century Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, who first developed a method of classifying plants, insects, and animals, the New England Society was a group of interested amateurs inspired to promote the study of natural history. None of them were trained scientists, but they all shared a curiosity about the world around them, exploring, unearthing, dissecting, and classifying all manner of animal, plant, and mineral life. Leading citizens in their communities, most had day jobs as bankers, lawyers, or merchants. In their spare time, they were amateur botanist, geologist, psychiatrist, chemist, entomologist, anthropologist, paleontologist, and avid students of whatever excited their curiosity. And reports of a giant horned serpent in Gloucester Harbor were just too exciting to pass up. And so it was that a committee of the Linnaean Society conducted a careful examination of the event, beginning with the interrogation of the most credible witnesses. A detailed 25-item questionnaire was created, and witnesses were interviewed separately. The results, however, were always very similar, and the committee's members' growing conviction that the sea serpent had indeed visited Gloucester many times was reinforced on September 27th, when what appeared to be, to many, a baby sea serpent was captured and killed just outside the harbor. This much smaller serpent was spotted near Loblolly Cove, 4.5 miles out from Gloucester Harbor. You gotta love the names. Gloucester, man, you guys are good at naming little coves and stuff. Locals speared it and beat it to death with rocks. Once it had perished, they brought the corpse ashore for further study. What they had was a 3.5-foot long serpent, I say that with quotations around it, with bumps on its back, very similar in appearance to what witnesses of the much larger serpent had claimed to see. Soon commonly described as a, quote, baby sea serpent, the dead creature was widely exhibited, and the Linnaean Committee members were convinced that this was indeed the child of the giant beast that had frequented Gloucester Harbor earlier that summer. The alleged new species was given a formal Latin name by the Linnaean Society, Scoliophis atlanticus. The Linnaean Society believed that they had reason to celebrate if they could prove the existence of sea serpents, which, until now, had only existed in the wild tales of old sailors. They would be known as great men of science around the world. Based on this baby serpent corpse, which they now had in their possession, a new sketch was commissioned. And the new illustration shows a giant serpent swimming in Gloucester Harbor, looking very much like a big version of this smaller baby serpent. This sketch was far more faithful to the witnesses' descriptions than the image we talked about earlier. Despite the Linnaean Society's high hopes, upon dissection, the baby serpent turned out to be nothing but a common black snake. The bumps on its back were caused by tumors under the snake's skin. In an attempt to settle the question of the harbor creature's identity once and for all, even the embarrassed Linnaean Society now agreed that the giant serpent had to be captured, killed, and studied. In August of 1818, a year after the first sightings, the Society hired Captain Richard Rich, yes, Captain Richie Rich, a well-regarded and experienced whaler, to assemble a crew and harpoon the serpent. All right, now we have our Ahab, we have our Quint. His name is Captain Richie Rich. Let's do this thing. Rich purposely recruited fishermen who believed that they had seen the serpent before and waited for a day when the weather and the seas were similar to those earlier sightings. When the serpent was reported to be seen swimming near Ansequim Bar, he assembled his crew and they went off in pursuit of the beast. Rich later recalled that when his prey was first sighted, he was convinced he was looking at a sea serpent at least 100 feet long. They were unable to capture the beast that day, but they did not give up the hunt. On August 6th, after repeated failed efforts, he succeeded in killing the beast. After harpooning it, the catch was hauled aboard and identified as a large horse mackerel, known today as the Atlantic bluefin tuna. Captain Rich, though an experienced deep-sea sailor, realized that he had been deceived by the behavior of this fast-moving fish, breaking the surface as it plunged ahead and leaving in its wake a series of prominent ripples on the water's surface, looking not unlike the bumps that witnesses described earlier. With this, much of the excitement around the serpent dissipated and reports of sightings lessened, though they never fully went away. More on that later. With so many documented, credible witness statements, it seems clear that there really was something strange in Gloucester Harbor in the summer of 1817. But the question remains, what was it? So let's discuss some of the explanations. Well, of course, the first explanation is that it really was a giant serpent. Some believe that such creatures may well have once existed, but are now extinct, the victim of perhaps overfishing, climate change, pollution, and the dumping of any number of toxic substances into the sea. Aside from numerous yet differing eyewitness reports, there is very little to support this theory, however. Another explanation is that this could be a kind of delusion. One person sees an anomaly of some kind, rationalizes it in their own mind as a sea serpent, reports it to others, and then they, the others, head to the beach hoping and perhaps expecting to see a monster. Looking out into the water with untrained eyes, any strange movement becomes something fantastic. For example, you might look off into the distance expecting to see a monster, and then, what may actually be a duck swimming off in the distance, you're looking out expecting that, you're here to see a monster, and you're not too familiar. Maybe you don't look out into the sea very often, and at a distance, the duck turns its head in kind of a funny way, and you say, "What is that? That's the head of some kind of giant monster." We've heard about this kind of thing happening before. Happens all the time with haunted places. If you're someone who believes in ghosts, you go in hearing that there are ghosts, expecting that there will be a ghost, and then you see or you hear something strange, and you're the next person saying that there's a ghost in this place. This happens all the time. So we don't mean delusion as in like everybody cray, but, maybe they worked themselves up a little bit too much and started seeing what they wanted to see instead of what they were actually seeing. And this leads us very well into our next possible explanation, and probably the one that I favor, which is misidentification of known animals. Now, when I say known animals, I mean known to us today, but they actually might not have been known to the people of Gloucester in 1817. There are some species of fish and, other marine animals that have only been officially classified and identified after 1817. So, for example, they could have seen a school of fish, such as the aforementioned Atlantic bluefin tuna, swimming by and mistaken their up and down movements and the wake that they caused, just like Captain Richie Rich described, as a large sea serpent. Bluefin tuna are very, very large, by the way. I was looking up YouTube videos about them, which, again, longtime listeners will know. You guys know I'm not really into fish, but still very interesting to watch. I watched a lot of ocean life videos in preparation for this episode, and to see which ones I thought looked most like a sea serpent, which could be misidentified. And pretty much anything kind of jumping in and out of the water, up and down like that, if you could mistake that as a sea serpent. I can see where people would do that. And honestly, I'm probably one of the people that would, because I wouldn't know what I was looking at. But I know sea serpents. I know those legends. So when I looked out into the water, being someone who's not on the water all the time, not very familiar with the water, I might be one of those people who deluded themselves. But yeah, so Atlantic bluefin tuna, that's one answer. What about the narwhal? Now, the narwhal was suggested, perhaps other people suggested it, but where I saw it was from the Skeptical Inquirer, and it was written by Joe Nickell, who was a very famous skeptic. I believe he either is or was the publisher of Skeptical Inquirer, but he works with them extensively in any event. And you see him all the time on TV shows and stuff. When they need a skeptic for something, he's often the one that they go to. And I usually enjoyed Joe Nickell, but I have to say, I found something lacking in his reporting on this particular event. Because now he says the narwhal. Now, the reason he chose the narwhal as the creature they could be misidentifying is because it is the only marine creature. So he says, I'm not sure about this. I didn't fact check this, but that has a tusk like this. Like a walrus obviously has, large teeth, tusks. But the narwhal is the only one that has it growing out of its head. It's actually not growing out of its forehead. It is growing out of its mouth, but it looks like it's coming off the top of its head. And it stands out straight, and it can grow up to, several feet long. And that's what people said this creature had. It had a large, horn like this. And so he says, well, if they're seeing a horn, then it must be a narwhal. But I take issue with this because I think that there are better explanations for what people were seeing. And also, it's true that, maybe things were different in 1817 than they are today. But it seems like narwhals really like Arctic waters, and they wouldn't come so far south as Gloucester, especially in the summer. So it's possible that this was like a freak occurrence, and that's why it seems so strange. And maybe these narwhals ended up in Gloucester Harbor somehow, and that's why it was such an anomaly. But I just feel like he's hinging it on that one descriptor that only some people said. I think it was only one or two people said that they saw a horn. And he's saying, well, obviously this is what it was. And the article makes it sound very definite. This is it. This is what it was. And, like I said, normally I'm a fan of Skeptical Inquirer. I'm a fan of Joe Nickell, but I was really taken aback by how, sure he was. And then instead of putting it forward as a theory, it just seemed like he was saying this is definitely what it was. And I don't agree. I think probably it was not a narwhal, just based on other things. I think actually it was probably, if it was a misidentified creature other than a school. The other thing is it could be that it wasn't just one thing, right? People described it differently. Maybe people were looking out at different times and saw different anomalies or known things that they didn't recognize. And so, this became the serpent. But if there was an actual unusual creature visiting the bay that time, I think it's more likely that it was this next suspect, which is an oar fish. Oar fish usually live in the deep Atlantic, and they have several long red protuberances that may be mistaken for spikes or wayward red tongues on the top of their heads. Now, I'm sure there's an official name for what those things are and why they have them, but I don't know what it is. I'm not a fish guy. But their heads do look very much like parrots, which one of our witnesses said this creature's head looked like a parrot. And they can grow officially as large as 26 feet long. That's substantiated reports. But there are some that say they can actually grow to be over 100 feet long, although those reports are unsubstantiated. Now, if an oarfish was not known in 1817, it had not been officially recognized, but it is recognized now. And you can find YouTube videos and you can find pictures, and these things look like sea serpents. They don't, they're thin. They're not big round things, but otherwise they are very long. There's one picture, I think one washed up on a beach in California. So it was near an army base, and there's a bunch of army guys holding up. I think this is the largest one that they have on record. This is the 26-foot one. It's very big, and it looks like they're holding up a sea serpent. So, it's to me, that sounds like it could be what it was. Head like a parrot. Well, let me correct myself a little bit here. The witness earlier said that the creature had a head like a sea turtle or a sea tortoise, actually not a parrot, but those heads are more similar than different, I think, in my opinion, and certainly look more like each other than the head of a narwhal. Big red things coming off the top of its head. It does move more side to side in the water like a snake would, but it's also got, I don't know if you'd call it a fin or whatever, but it's got like this like kind of thin filmy red layer on the top of its back, like going all the way down the length of the body. And that thing kind of undulates, and it's also going side to side. But if you see it just right, it does kind of look, it's really neat looking, actually. It kind of looks like it goes up and down a little bit. So maybe that's what people were seeing. I don't know. Or again, just different animals. So some people saw an oar fish, and that's what, they saw this head, and they saw these red protuberances, again, probably, I don't know what you'd call them. I don't know what they are. And mistook those as horns or a tongue. And then they, maybe they saw a school of fish swimming up and down speedily and mistook that as the creature. So I think it's probably a combination of different creatures. But who's to say for sure, because there have been further sightings, as I mentioned earlier. Though there were no more flurried reports like there had been in 1817, there still have been reports of the sea serpent continuing to this very day all throughout coastal New England, not just in Gloucester, but all throughout coastal New England. In fact, reports of such creatures in these waters predate the Gloucester cluster sightings by centuries. It is estimated that between 1623 and present day, there have been about 300 reported and documented sightings of sea serpents in New England waters. In recognition of the strange events of 1817 and Gloucester's resident cryptid, a sculpture of the sea serpent, created by local sculptor Chris Williams, was placed outside the Cape Ann Museum in 2018. So this Gloucester Sea Serpent, I'm surprised it's not more famous than it is, to be honest with you. When you talk about Massachusetts cryptids, I think the Dover Demon comes up a lot, but you don't hear about this Gloucester Sea Harbor. And I think part of it is because it doesn't have a name. They don't call it like, the Beast of the East or something like that. I was watching a YouTube video and someone suggested the name Glossy. I think that's a perfectly good suggestion, Glossy. So I think that's one thing. They got to get a catchy name for it. But I mean, this is a pretty incredible story. It seems like there was definitely something unusual going on in the harbor, or there was some kind of mass delusion that made everyone look out and see normal things and say there's, a crazy monster in the water. But even so, that's very interesting too. So I think this case should be more well known, and I'm glad to see that Gloucester at least celebrates it, and it's cool that they have this badass looking sculpture outside the Cape Ann Museum, which is located in downtown Gloucester. And people can go and enjoy it and learn the story of the Gloucester Sea Serpent there. Now, as I mentioned before, much of this story that I read today came right out of an article from the Gloucester Daily Times. The article was entitled "The Myth and Mystery of the Great Gloucester Sea Serpent," and it was written by Tom Halstead. So I want to give credit for that, because some of what I just read to you, I lifted directly from that very informative and very well done article by Tom Halstead for the Gloucester Daily Times. And that is the end of the Gloucester Sea Serpent, but it's not the end of the show, because, of course, I want to talk a little bit of business here. I like to do it at the end of the show, so you can tune out if you're not interested. If you just want to hear the spooky stories, then that's what you just heard, and you can turn off now. But if you want to know a little bit behind the scenes, you want to know a little bit what's going on here, why are we rebranding the show, let's talk about it now. So, this is something that I have flirted with for a very long time, pretty much since the show began. The original name of the show was Spooky Ass Shit. And that's because that's the way we talk, me and my friends. And, I started this show when I started doing comedy. And it was on the advice of a fellow comedian, a guy by the name of Will Noonan. You might have heard of him before, might have seen him on TV and TV commercials. Anyway, he said that I should consider doing a podcast because it will get me used to speaking, and that way, if I ever do interviews or just have to deal with a crowd, I'm used to speaking. I'm used to hearing my own voice. I'm used to thinking fast on my feet, even if it's not that I'm like telling jokes nonstop. And so this was really kind of an offshoot of my comedy career, I say with very large quotation marks and an eye roll. The idea was that I would have my comedy friends on, which I did at first, but then the comedy career kind of came to nothing for reasons I could get into, but that's a separate episode. Write in if you want me to talk about that someday. So the name, the irreverent kind of name, was also a reflection of the direction the show was going to go in. However, then when I loaded the show on iTunes, they were like, hey, you can't have this name. You can't have swear words right in your name and display it. So I had to change the name for iTunes to Spooky AS. So then I bought the website spookyasshit.com, but I also bought spookyas.com. And then, it just became like a big hassle. And then you tell people, what's the name of your show? And I have to say, well, it's Spooky Ass Shit, but you got to look up Spooky AS on iTunes. And that's space bar S, not a dot S dot or spooky. So it just became like a whole thing. And I honestly should have changed the name years ago, but I stick with things for a while. So I did try it out. I still like the name Spooky Ass Shit. I'm still going to take some getting used to, but now we are spooky times. And it's not only for that reason. Another reason is, like I say, the original idea of the show was to be more of a comedy show, but I think it's taking a different direction. It has taken a different direction where, yes, we are a little bit more lighthearted, perhaps a little bit more irreverent than other like paranormal shows because it's hosted by a skeptic who doesn't believe in most of the paranormal things. However, I'm still very interested and curious and studious and somewhat academic. And I would like to have serious people on the show once in a while. For example, in my capacity as the Witchfinder General of Salem, Massachusetts, I was invited to make a YouTube video going on tour in the Peabody Essex Museum of their 1692 witchcraft exhibit. They got all the documents and some of the items that belonged to some of the victims and the judges and just people who lived in town at the time on display for the first time in 30 years. And I was very, very interested in that. I was there opening day, bought my ticket, and went through opening morning. And then I was invited to come and do this video along with a man by the name of Emerson Tad Baker, who is a professor and vice provost at Salem State University. And we talked about different items in the museum together, had a great time. But he's literally an expert on early New England and New England witchcraft. He's written 2 books about New England witchcraft. And I said, hey, I would love to have you on my podcast sometime. And he gave me a tentative yes, politely. And then asked, what the show was. And I avoided saying the name. I might have said Spooky AS, but I just realized, I'm like, oh, now that I'm talking with serious people and I want to have serious people on the podcast, it might be better, to change the name and be not totally serious. Spooky Times is still a silly name, and I still want it to be a silly name because we're an irreverent kind of podcast, but something that at least they could share with their colleagues or students or whoever and not be like, oh, I can't be associated with something called Spooky Ass Shit, So just to give us a little bit more credibility, a little bit more seriousness, and so we can say the name on, different channels that we want to broadcast the show on. So there's a whole whole slew of reasons, and I hope you guys understand. I love the old show, but it's, really just a change in name and branding only. I hope you guys like the new logo. You can still find us on social media. All right, it's getting a little crazy. I'm trying to switch everything over. Some things I'm not sure I'm going to. The website is still spookyas.com. It might stay that way. It might not. I don't think the website is all that important. I don't think too many of you found the show from there. And even if you do, Spooky AS is still a memorable website name. I don't know. I might change it. I might not. And you can find us on Facebook. But now to find us on Facebook, you've got to go to facebook.com/spookytimeswitheric.d. So that's a bit longer, but it'll take you to the page there. And on Instagram, we are still at SpookyAsShit. I'm not sure if I'm going to change that or not, because I've got almost 200 episodes where I tell you to follow me there. I don't know. Write in and tell me if you think total 100% rebranding across the board is better, or if we just leave some things the way they are if it's not, overly important. So that's the story there. And until next time, don't be afraid.
Spooky Times is a Witchfinder production.